An interesting concept we have in failover clustering is Quorum. Quorum achieves a consensus that enough members are available to provide a service to my clients. The quorum is based on votes. So every server in the cluster has a vote. So that's going to be set up on your nodes. You can also use a file share. Now, the way that works and what it actually means, in this example, every node, I'm just going to call them A, B, C, and D, my nodes, has a copy of this quorum, which is just a little tiny file is all it is, just kilobytes in size. But what that quorum does is give each server a vote. So in this picture right now, I have 5 copies of a quorum. Each node has 1 copy of the quorum, and this has 1 copy of the quorum, the file share. Now, we will call that a file share witness, is what that's actually called. Now, the way this works, you have to have a majority of these quorums for services to be available. So I have 5 total. Let's say 2 of your nodes fail. Well, that's fine, because you still have a majority of your quorums, C, D nodes, and the file share, so you still have a majority. But let's say node C fails. You no longer have a majority. Now, 3 of these quorums are unavailable, 2 are available. What that has always meant for us, your entire failover cluster has now failed. It basically says, more than half of these are offline, so I'm just going to shut down the entire cluster. Now, in addition to having a file share witness, you can also have a disk witness. Now, this can be any type of disk, because again, the quorum is very small, but that would be your disk witness, and this would have been your file share. Just writes a copy of the quorum to the disk. So file share or disk witness is an option. You can also use an Azure witness. Now, this would be the newest of the 2. Your witness just lives in the cloud, so I don't need to store this on a local disk or a file share in my environment. You just have an Azure witness. Those would be your 3 options. Now, the point of this is to stop what we call a split brain cluster. What that actually is, let's say in this graphic, nodes A and B somehow get cut off from C and D. They can't communicate with each other. Now let's say node A was active all along. Nodes B, C, and D were passive, so they were not actively responding to clients. But nothing is wrong with node A, so it responds to clients. But when communication gets disrupted, node D says, we can't talk to the other, so I'm going to go ahead and become active. Well, let's say somehow we also lose communication with node C. Node C says, I can't see anybody else, but I'm in a failover cluster. I'm going to become active as well. Well, now you have a problem, because some clients that connect to the cluster may get routed to node A. Other clients will be routed to node C, other clients to node D. The problem, if this was a database cluster, all 3 of these nodes would be connected into your database, we'll say DB, and they would be making changes. So if somebody purchased something, this server would reach in and reduce a quantity. But the problem is these 3 servers would be updating the same database file without any consultation between each other. So your database would quickly become a mess, is the term I use. But we would have out-of-date information now in our database because these 3 servers, independent of one another, made changes to the database, and you have no possible way to actually reconcile that. So the thought always was to make sure that does not happen. If you don't have a quorum, now quorum simply means majority. They could have just called it majority. If you don't have a majority of your quorums online, cluster communication ceases, the entire cluster shuts down. So with this, just always think of the quorum as every node has a copy of it, and we can also have a copy on a file share, disk, or in Azure. But it is to equal a majority. Now, you only need Azure disk or file share if you have an even number of nodes. If you have an odd number, like let's say your cluster only has 3 servers, then you will never end up in a tie. You will always have a majority one way or the other. So if one goes offline, you still have majority online because you have 2 online. If 2 go offline, 1 is online, you no longer have a majority, so you don't have quorum. What you can have is a 4-node cluster without one of these 3, because if 2 go offline and 2 remain online, you don't have a quorum because you end up in a tie. That could never happen. Then you would be required to have one of these 3 configured. That is the way clusters have traditionally worked. But that is now considered a legacy concept. A newer concept we have that was introduced in Server 2012, so not really new, but you could have configured a failover cluster going all the way back to Windows 2000. So, relative to that, it's a newer concept. Dynamic quorum. Now, with a dynamic quorum, you can use a disk witness, you can use a file share, you can use an Azure cloud witness. So the same 3 we discussed earlier. Now, depending on exactly what your goal is, depends on which one you use. Like, you need an Azure subscription to use an Azure cloud witness. The default and the Microsoft recommendation is to always use a dynamic quorum. Now, to compare a dynamic quorum to what we just discussed, a dynamic quorum will run on the last surviving node. Now, this concept, I will tell you, it's a little strange, but the way it works with a dynamic quorum, this will run until there's only 1 server left. So never would it say, we don't actually have a majority, so I'm going to go ahead and go offline if you are the last server in the cluster. What happens, when you go offline, you simply no longer factor into the quorum. So if I had my witness, we'll say that's a witness disk, and I have these 4 servers. Well, let's say here, this server goes offline, this server goes offline, and server 3 goes offline. Well, you no longer have a quorum. The old days of this, your entire cluster would be in a failed state because you no longer have a majority of your quorums. These 3 would be offline. Only 2 would remain online. What happens when this server fails, it loses its vote. So now it says, oh, there's only 3 quorums left. We have 2 online, 1 offline. So no matter what, it always ends up with you having quorum. If you don't have a quorum, like I truly do not have a quorum in this picture, but it would just cancel the votes out of these 2, so it always would be considered to have a quorum. Now, do you need to know that? Absolutely not. That is just how it works under the hood. What you need to know is if you have 1 server in your cluster, 1 node that actually functions, your cluster continues to function. Just the way Microsoft has this designed under the hood, I always say it's wonky is the term I use, but no, it'll just run all the way down to the last surviving node. And that's what they mean by the term dynamic. It automatically recalculates the quorum anytime there's a failure in the cluster just to make sure a quorum is always achieved.